Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We got about half of the people we've registered in here at the moment. So we're going to go a couple more minutes to let people get signed in, make sure they've got Zoom all figured out, and then we will get started in just a few minutes here. So hang tight and I'll be back with you soon. Hello, if you are just joining us, we are going to take a couple more minutes here. We've got people kind of slowly trickling into the Zoom webinar still. So we're going to give it 2 more minutes and get started at 4:05. So hang tight and we will see you soon. All right. Thank you everybody for being here. We are so excited to be able to be streamed right into your homes for our webinar today. My name is Asa Dean. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of the Forest. If you haven't heard of us, just a quick little background. We formed in 1987 in response to the continued logging of the Anacortes Community Forest Land. And through a citizen-led campaign bringing together a variety of people on Fidalgo Island, we helped to end logging in the ACFL and eventually to permanently protect most of the nearly 3,000 acres of forest land in conjunction with the Skagit Land Trust and the city of Anacortes. That mission continues to this day. We continue to strive for the preservation of the ACFL through a combination of education, outreach, and stewardship. So in line with that mission and those methods, we were really excited this year to revamp and restart our community speaker series. It's something we've done in the past, but it hasn't been very consistent, and we were really looking forward to having a quarterly series, having a different speaker every quarter, keeping it consistent, a way for folks to engage, to get excited about learning about the forest lands. And we had our first speaker series at our annual meeting in February, and I was actually the speaker, and I went through history of the forest lands and history of the Friends of the Forest. It was really fun, and we're really looking forward to continuing this series the rest of this year and hopefully beyond. Then, of course, the world changed a little bit, and all of a sudden we couldn't even be in the office together as a staff, let alone in a crowded room full of people. So we've been very fortunate as a staff. We've all remained healthy, knock on wood, and we're all able to work remotely. We're also really fortunate as a community, as the ACFL has remained open, and it's been this beacon of light for folks to get outside and exercise and connect with nature for the COVID situation we have going on. So before we go any further, I do want to give a huge thank you to the City of Anacortes Parks and Recreation Department. They have been working incredibly hard to try and keep the forest open, make sure that people are still able to get out into the trails, still go for their runs, go for their bike rides, and get into that forest land for their physical health, but also for all of our mental and emotional health as well. So a huge thank you to the Parks and Rec Department for keeping that open for everybody. We're also really lucky that despite not being able to physically be with each other right now, we are still able to have this speaker series and to present it virtually to you all. And that's really good news because I am really excited about the presentation tonight. It's going to be really interesting and informative. You know, we get so myopic towards our beloved forest lands, connecting all the dots within the forest themselves of all the species and habitats and ecosystems. And we sometimes forget to pay attention to the connection and to everything around them, the world around them, even one as important as the Salish Sea. So I'm really excited about today's talk to learn a little bit more about both of these environments individually, and also to learn a bit about how they're intricately connected with each other. So being a webinar, there are some details that you should know about before we get started. So first off, we are recording this entire webinar, and we are going to post it to our YouTube page, and we'll make it available to everybody after the presentation ends tonight. So if you do want to go back and review something, or if you want to recommend it to a friend, you can send them to our YouTube page and check it out starting probably later this week. You're also going to be getting a follow-up email tomorrow with a thank you and a couple of links for you to follow. We're going to have a couple of instances where you might want to get some more information tonight, and so we'll include those links in that final email that will go out tomorrow. And as you can see, the main visual on your screen is the presentation itself, but with a little video box to the side with the presenter's face in it. Currently, I am speaking, so you can probably, hopefully, see my face at the moment. But you can move that box. So if it's in the way or you want to minimize it, you can get it out of the way so you can see the presentation easier, whatever you need to do. Also, during this presentation, we aren't going to be able to see or hear you, but you'll still be able to ask us questions and ask the presenters questions. So to tell us a little bit more about how that is going to work, I'm going to send it on over to my friend and communications director, Mackenzie Wilson.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and see me okay. So during this presentation, I'll be moderating the questions, and there'll be a couple pauses throughout the presentation where we'll take a minute or two to address a question or two. But if you do ask a question and in those pauses we don't get to yours, don't worry, we'll get to a majority of the questions at the end of the presentation. So if you do have a question, if you move your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little Q&A button, and you can press that button and then type in your question, and I'll see it and we'll be able to get to it. So I'm really excited. And I'll turn it back over to Asa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mackenzie. So the last thing I want to say before we get started here is that if you do enjoy the webcast today and you find yourself financially able, we would really appreciate if you consider making a donation to the Friends of the Forest. We're actually in the middle of a big giving campaign right now known as Give Big Washington. And what it is a statewide fundraising event for nonprofits that culminates in a big 48-hour giving campaign next week on May 5th and 6th. And its goal is to inspire individuals to invest back in their communities in meaningful ways. And actually, even though the campaign, the 48 hours is next week, you can actually give as of right now. And part of the reason we're pushing this at the moment is there's been a huge increase in the use of the ACFL, one that has helped to connect or reconnect hundreds or even thousands of people to the forest lands. So when sheltering in place is no longer required, that use will go down a little bit, but we're still going to see a use of the forest land at a higher level than ever before is what we're anticipating. So it's imperative that we continue to educate the public about the ACFL, to connect them to it and help them understand that it's up to all of us to work together and protect the forest. So if you are able and want to help us increase our programming, including more speaker series events like this one, whether they're online or in person, hopefully, then you can head over to www.givebigwa.org/Friends of the Forest. And don't worry, I'm going to put that in the chat box so you can see it, and I'm also going to link it in the email you'll get tomorrow. So don't feel like you have to scramble to write that down right now. But if you do have the means and you are willing, a really exciting part of this campaign is that the Friends of the Forest Board has committed to contributing up to $3,000 of matching funds. So if you donate through Give Big between now and May 6th, you are essentially doubling your impact. And like I said, that link will be included in the email tomorrow, and I'm going to try and put it into the chat box in just a second. So thank you again for being here. I'm super excited about this webinar and really curious to hear folks' thoughts afterwards and see how it goes. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to our presenters, Melissa Courtney and Sam Murphy.
Thank you, Asa and Mackenzie. Like Asa said, my name is Melissa Courtney, and I come to you with a bachelor's in environmental science and a master's in environmental education. I've built my knowledge of our area on that foundation and an interest in ecosystems, climate, and water sciences. My prior work includes research on species predicted to be impacted by climate change, field surveys of endangered species and wetlands impacted by development, and old growth tree surveys for habitat restoration and conservation. Since working with the Friends of the Forest, I've loved continuing to learn about our unique forest ecosystems. And thank you all for joining. And now I'm going to pass it over to Sam.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, so my name is Sam Murphy. I'm a graduate from the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. During my time at the UW, I had the opportunity to study various regions of our world's oceans, including spending time at the School for Field Studies in Turks and Caicos, the Friday Harbor Labs, locally here in the San Juan Islands, and time working with the Hawaiian monk seal team in Oahu to assess how disease might have impacted or can impact that endemic and endangered population. Following graduation, I spent some time traveling, but as soon as I got home, I started working here in Anacortes at Island Adventures Whale Watching, where I have been for the past few years as a marine naturalist. So I'm happy to be here presenting with Melissa today. And while she tells you a little bit about our local forests, I'm going to tell you about the Salish Sea and our local kelp forests. So let's jump right in. We are going to break down this presentation into 4 main sections. So first, we'll talk about the factors that influence our local climate, and in turn, how that climate creates the conditions within which these 2 ecosystems flourish. Then we're going to paint an ecological picture of both our lowland conifer forests and kelp forest ecosystems with information on biodiversity, succession, and the ecosystem services they provide. We're going to follow that by telling you how these 2 ecosystems are intricately connected and talk about how those connections, what they are and why they are so important. And then we're going to follow it up by bringing it back to our local Anacortes Forest Lands and Fidalgo Island, where we will be talking about our local connections and how we can best ensure the integrity of both our terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems and those corridors. So Without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Melissa, and she's going to start by telling you a little bit about how climate influences our local systems.
Thanks, Sam. So the first thing we want to talk about is what influences our local climate. And then we'll look at how the local climate creates the right conditions for our tree and sea forests. So there are several factors that have a definite influence on our local climate, but mainly it's influenced by the Pacific Ocean, terrain, and the atmospheric pressure regions located over the North Pacific. So how do these global factors influence our area? So let's first take a look at the Pacific Ocean's influence. The ocean regulates the global climate in two main ways, one of which is latent heat retention. The Pacific Ocean can absorb and retain a ton of solar radiation in the form of heat. The ocean then slowly exchanges this heat with the atmosphere over time. Because of this, the ocean does not experience big swings in temperature throughout the year, and the result is a warmer ocean in the winter and a cooler ocean in the summer relative to the land. The second way the ocean regulates the climate is through circulation. So the ocean moves this stored heat around the world by acting like one huge conveyor belt. The conveyor belt works because of changes in salt and temperature at the poles due to sea ice formation. It is of huge importance and a driver of global climate because of its function in transferring heat and nutrients throughout all of the world's oceans. All of this is not a very fast process though. It takes about 1,000 years for one molecule of water to make the entire journey around the world on this global conveyor belt. So another regionally important component of ocean circulation are the surface currents, which only reach to be about 90 to 300 feet deep. So what drives these surface currents? It's mainly the prevailing westerly wind belt that exists from about 30 to 60 degrees north latitude. These westerlies are a result of the Coriolis effect, which is the effect of the Earth's rotation on moving air and water. Because of the Earth's rotation, heated air traveling from the equator to the poles is deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. So if you look at the images on the right of the slide, you'll see the locations of the westerlies and a simple graphic illustrating how the Coriolis effect works. Now our local surface current is the North Pacific equatorial current, which runs clockwise north of the equator, stretching from Asia to North America. As it moves eastward towards the Pacific Northwest, the water cools, and as it moves towards Asia, it runs close to the equator, and the water warms because the equator receives more direct solar rays. So generally, the current works to redistribute surface heat from the tropical to the polar regions, scatter nutrients important to our kelp forests, and influence weather and climate along coastal regions important to our coastal lowland forests.
Okay, so Melissa defined the Coriolis effect for you, but now I'd like to dive into it a little bit deeper because the Coriolis effect impacts more than just the direction of airflow. It also influences water movement. So let's use Washington's outer coast as an example and say that wind blows from north to south along the coastline. So if the Earth weren't rotating, the water would move south as it is pushed by the wind. However, due to the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation, that water will get pulled west or to the right. In the northern hemisphere, ultimately water moves about 90 degrees to the right of wind stress. This is known as Ekman transport. So the transport of this surface water offshore leaves a void waiting to be filled, and deep oceanic water rich in oxygen and nutrients rushes up to fill this void. This process is known as upwelling. The cold nutrient-rich water brought via upwelling is key to the productivity we see within our local Salish Sea ecosystem. So try to remember these processes as we continue this discussion. Okay, so we went over how the Pacific Ocean influences climate. Now we're going to delve into how regional terrain, the next factor, influences our local climate. So here in Anacortes, we are in the Olympic rain shadow. The Olympic Mountains and the extension of the coastal range on Vancouver Island shield us from the brunt force of the winter storms that roll in from the Pacific Ocean. So the majority of the Puget Sound Basin, which stretches from Blaine down to Seattle, receives about 32 to 35 inches of rainfall a year, whereas here in the Olympic rain shadow, we only receive about 25 to 30 inches of rainfall a year. So we're in a bit of a dry zone. Now, further east, the presence of the Cascade Mountain Range results in increased precipitation. And this is due to the fact that typically higher elevation leads to cooler air and atmospheric temperatures. And that cool air cannot hold in as much condensation. So this precipitation then makes its way down to the Salish Sea throughout the year by way of our local watersheds, creating a complex and productive estuarine system within the Salish Sea. Okay, so the third factor that influences our local climate is atmospheric patterns, or more specifically, the location and intensity of the semi-permanent high and low pressure areas over the North Pacific Ocean. So if you look at the diagram on the right, you will see the air circulates in a clockwise direction. I'm going to draw on the diagram here. Clockwise direction around the Pacific High, and which is the semi-permanent high pressure cell, and in a counterclockwise direction, this way, around the Aleutian Low, which is the semi-permanent low pressure cell. Now, in the fall and winter seasons, the Aleutian Low Pressure Center intensifies and moves southwards, reaching a maximum intensity in midwinter. During this time, this is a zone of activity where numerous storms form. And actually, if you look at the two images on the left, you can see satellite views of the types of storm systems that move into our region during the winter season. Now, at the same time, the high pressure area becomes weaker and moves southwards. So a circulation of air around these two pressure centers brings a prevailing southwesterly and westerly flow of air into the Pacific Northwest. When this air from over the ocean, which is moist and similar to the temperature of the water, moves inland over the cooler land and rises up to the mountains, remember we talked about the Cascades, this results in precipitation and thus our wet winter and fall season. Now on the flip side, during the spring and summer, the low pressure cell becomes weak and moves north of the Aleutian Islands. So at the same time, the high pressure area spreads over most of the North Pacific Ocean. A circulation of air around the high pressure center begins a prevailing westerly and northwesterly flow of comparatively dry, cool, and stable air into the Pacific Northwest. And as the air moves inland, it becomes warmer and drier, which then results in a dry season beginning in the late spring and reaching peak in midwinter.
Right, so now we know how these three factors work to influence our climate. Well, these three climate factors also create something else that's important to our local forests, which is marine fog. So marine fog is important for many species of plants that make up our lowland conifer forests. Actually, up to 80% of our coastal understory species, including sword ferns and huckleberry, have evolved to absorb fog droplets directly through leaf pores and surfaces. And this adaptation is especially important in the summer months when we only receive about 5% of our yearly precipitation, but have a high frequency of foggy mornings. Although fog is not considered precipitation, certainly our conifers like Douglas fir make it so. These types of trees, with their up to 30,000 square feet of needle surface area, are so good at combing the air for fog moisture that they produce what is known as needle drip. Thanks to this ability, up to 20% of the annual precipitation in the lowland conifer forests come from needle drip, which then can make its way into ground and surface water to be used by our other forest inhabitants. Marine fog also reduces summertime air temperatures and evaporation, which means reduced plant stress, more photosynthesis, and increased soil metabolism. All of these things add together and means higher overall ecosystem productivity. So let's go ahead and break down how these three climate factors create marine fog. Marine fog is a combination of three components: condensation nuclei, cool humid air, and the sea breeze. Our local atmospheric patterns help create the first condition necessary for fog, which is condensation nuclei. Condensation nuclei are tiny particles like dust that water vapor can condense around after it evaporates into the atmosphere. The consistent onshore breeze from the low and high pressure systems stir up the water surface, which releases salt spray into the atmosphere. These sea salt aerosols are excellent condensation nuclei. Bacteria, fungal spores, aerosols, and pollen all from the forest also add to this bank of nuclei needed to create fog. The North Pacific equatorial current brings in that relatively cool air, which cools down the air above the ocean. Since the cool air can't hold as much moisture as warm air, the water vapor condenses around those condensation nuclei to produce that fog. So coastal terrain then becomes a factor. So it helps to move our fog onto our forests where it can be used by plants. This is through the sea breeze effect. So as the sun rises, it heats up the land faster than the sea. And as the air above the land heats up, it rises. And so that foggy, cool air that's hanging out above the ocean can fill in its place. The summer climate also makes kelp forests work to create marine fog for our tree forests. Researchers have recently found that under stress from intense sunlight and higher temperatures, kelp releases particles of iodine. These iodine particles are also excellent condensation nuclei, and one way these two ecosystems interact.
Yeah, so the climate drivers that we just covered don't just influence our lowland conifer forests, they also play a huge role in making the Salish Sea the incredibly productive ecosystem that it is. So I mentioned that the Salish Sea is a complex estuarine ecosystem, and this is due to the continuous mixing of fresh and salt water within it. So the fresh water is coming from the 19 major rivers and 45 watersheds that empty into this basin, and salt water, of course, is coming from the greater Pacific Ocean. Now, the freshwater input carries nutrients from land into our sea, but perhaps even more importantly, the estuarine circulation, or mixing, that is driven by the tides drives upwelling of deeper oceanic waters from the Pacific, water which again is rich in nutrients and oxygen. So there's actually a study conducted in 2014, and the study showed that nitrogen exiting the Strait of Juan de Fuca, so coming from our sea and then out through the strait, is almost entirely of ocean origin. So when they say entirely, they mean 98% of that nitrogen is of ocean origin. And that means that the oceanic circulation and atmospheric drivers that we discussed, which drive that upwelling off the coast, have a very real impact on our inland sea. So to recap, oceanic circulation and upwelling, local terrain, and atmospheric patterns all influence our local climate, and that climate has set the stage for the development of both our lowland conifer forests and kelp forests. So now we're going to dive into these two unique forests and introduce the cast of characters that call them home, while also painting a picture of how these forests came to be. But before we do, we're going to pause really quick to check in with Mackenzie, just in case any questions have come in before we continue on.
All right, thank you. So it looks like currently we don't have any questions, but I want to take just a minute pause here. So, oh, we got one. So if anybody does have a question right now, go ahead and type it into the box. We have a nice comment, all going really well. That's awesome, thank you. So I'll give just a couple more seconds if anybody has a question to type in. Give you just a moment. All right, so if you do think of anything, we'll have more time for questions later on. Well,
fantastic.
You guys.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Melissa, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about our Anacortes Forest Lands.
All right, thanks guys. So now that we have an understanding of the climate in our region, let's take a closer look at the forests in our backyard. So the dominance of evergreen conifers in the Pacific Northwest makes it unique amongst most other temperate regions of the world. Here, flowering plants are relegated to early successional roles or limited to stressful habitats. This is unlike other temperate regions where flowering plants are the dominant forest feature. The dominance of conifers in our region is, of course, a result of our regional climate. Conifers have a few adaptations that allow them to thrive in our area. If it is too dry, like in the summer, they have the ability to close the small pores on their leaves that allow gas exchange and photosynthesis. They are also waxy and small to minimize moisture loss through their leaf surfaces. And lastly, most conifers can angle their needles to maximize the rate of photosynthesis. So in the wet winter season, when deciduous trees lose their leaves, conifers can continue high rates of photosynthesis when they don't have to worry about moisture loss. Our forests are unique in another way as well. They are very diverse ecosystems. Despite making up less than 6.8% of the total conifer forests in the US, the Pacific Northwest lowland conifer forests have approximately 37% of US breeding bird species and 42% of US mammal species, which is pretty cool. So now let's take a closer look at the individuals that make up this diverse forest community, starting with our producers. At the base of the forest food web, transforming the energy from the sun into food are our forest plants. Conifers like western red cedar and Douglas fir dominate the landscape, and they're joined by characteristic understory plants like salal and salmonberry, as well as herbaceous ground cover like miner's lettuce and moss. In a survey of just 1 ACFL acre back in 2000, the Friends found over 8,000 visible plants, and all of these producers together make up the strong backbone of the forest food web. So moving up the food web, we have consumers, including the ones that are specially adapted to lowland conifer forests. We have many well-known mammal species in this category like beaver, Douglas squirrel, and black-tailed deer, as well as numerous reptiles, birds, and amphibians like the great blue heron, rough-skinned newt, and garter snake. The sheer amount of plants in our forest creates tons of plant debris, which eventually and thankfully decomposes. Most of this absolutely essential recycling work is performed by fungi. Many more species of fungi, including lichens, live in the forest than all other kinds of plants. Actually, in a healthy Douglas fir forest, you could expect to find over 2,000 fungal species. Mushrooms are actually only the visible part of the fungus, which the rest of it is actually underneath the ground, and it consists of a network of tiny hair-like tubes called hyphae that fill the soil and rotting debris in the forest. So there's a picture of fungal hyphae on the left-hand slide, and then the other fungal pictures you see on there are just the fruiting bodies. So fungi play such a big role in our forests that 1/5 of the soil mass can easily be made of fungi. And to put it another way, with each footstep you take through our forest, you can be stepping on over 300 miles of fungal filaments. So as I say to our 3rd graders on our field trips, our forest is like a team. It takes teamwork on all levels of the food web and long periods of time to transform land into an old growth forest. And this fact is reinforced by the strong relationships between these decomposers and our producers. These important decomposers not only help break down dead debris, they also act as an information and nutrient underground highway that creates a more healthy forest community. So now that we have a basic understanding of the players in the forest food web, let's go ahead and paint a picture of how our forests look and change over time. Our forests start in the pioneer stage after a major disturbance, such as a stand replacing fire. This is one that reaches the crowns of even the oldest trees, and in the lowland conifer forest happens very infrequently, about once every few hundred years. Our forest pioneer event happened about 14,000 years ago when the glaciers retreated, exposing the bare and thin glacial soils in our region. So the pioneer stage of growth is dominated by species that are good at establishing themselves based on proximity, ease of dispersal, and tolerance of high light conditions. So a few of our characteristic pioneer species here include fireweed, which easily rides in on the wind, red huckleberry, which is dispersed by animals, and ocean spray, which has a higher light tolerance. In areas that experience a fire disturbance, like along Trail 103 to the east of Little Cranberry Lake, you may also see pioneer species which have been dormant in a previous but more advanced stage of forest development. These species are likely well adapted to disturbance and can thrive after fires, like madrona, which stores its energy that it can use to regrow in a burrow underground, and fire moss, that has the ability to stabilize the burn slopes with its incredible water absorbing ability. So actually it can absorb up to 1,400% of its body weight in water. These pioneer species are important to the succession of the forests after a disturbance. So some ecosystems go through relatively fast succession, like those adapted to frequent fires, but our conifer forests have comparatively slow succession, and that's related to the long lifespans of many of our native trees and the lack of frequent fires. As time passes and complexity increases, the forest enters what is called the seral stage of succession. This is when it begins to take shape into a layered, closed canopy forest. Places in the areas like the northwest of Whistle Lake along Trail 233 and to the northeast of Little Cranberry Lake along Trail 100 show characteristics of this stage. During this stage, there is extreme competition for light as more trees grow to close the canopy and reduce light infiltration into the forest understory. As the competition ensues, light levels will continue to drop until many of the trees racing to the top die off. This opens the understory to light and gives other plants the opportunity to reach for the sun. So at this point, the forest will start to enter the old growth stage of succession, where the forest begins to look like a mosaic with areas of recently disturbed vegetation mixed in with old growth trees and woody debris. So if you explore south of Heart Lake along Trail 210 and east of Heart Lake on Trail 320, you can experience incredible pockets of old growth forest. So old growth stand characteristics include few to no non-native species and the presence of rare and native species, as well as, of course, massive conifers, which have their own telltale characteristics like deep bark furrows, which you can see on the bottom right of the slide. So some trees have bark that protects them from fire, like the Douglas fir. Their bark grows from the inside to the outside, so it starts growing from the inside. And so over time, as the tree grows bigger, the original bark that's been pushed to the outside starts to crack and forms those deep fissures in the bark that you see. And this bark can actually end up being about 9 inches thick by the time they reach the old growth stage. And because they hold on to their bark for so long, you can see fire scarring, which is another characteristic of some old growth trees as well, since it can remain on that tree for hundreds of years. Another characteristic of these old growth trees can be epicormic branching, which you can see above the deep furrows photo on the slide. So this happens when the tree really stops making branches or growing branches from the main stem, and it just grows branches from other old broken branches. So it kind of creates this gnarly branch looking thing coming out of the tree. So that, along with broken tree crowns, which you'll see in the bottom left, which is common in a lot of our old growth trees, work together to greatly increase the amount of foliage these trees can carry. And that means that each old growth conifer can have on average 60 million needles. So another notable characteristic of our old growth forests is dead woody debris. So these large living trees that I was just talking about leave a legacy after they die in the form of standing snags or accumulations of downed woody material on the land or in water. Snags can easily stand up for up to 200 years depending on the species, and along with downed woody material, add considerably to the overall ecological integrity of the old growth forests. All of this woody debris provides shelter and food sources for seedlings, small animals, and multitudes of microorganisms. It also decreases erosion and is a rich long-term nutrient source made available by the work of those decomposers and other forest inhabitants like woodpeckers that physically deconstruct the wood looking for a meal or a home. Woody debris also has the ability to act as a sponge, which is a valuable and reliable water source like the marine fog in summer months. Mosses, since they do not have true roots, easily dry out, so they are some of the species that really take advantage of these forest sponges. So the forest development reaches an equilibrium as an old growth forest when none of the living trees that originated immediately after the initial disturbance are still alive. The result is lowland conifer forests, which are complex and varied ecosystems that have balanced nutrient cycles, are highly productive, biodiverse, and have unique adaptations that allow them to thrive in our region. Now Sam is going to talk about our local sea forests and look at how the two, although physically separated, are very similar.
Yeah, okay guys, so just as the forest in our backyard hosts a diverse array of species, so too does the sea that surrounds us. In fact, the Salish Sea has a lot of different organisms that rely on it, including 37 species of mammals, 172 species of birds, 260 species of fish, over 3,000 species of invertebrates, and that's not even mentioning the primary producers like kelp. So our oceans are home to forests too, guys, and here in the Salish Sea, kelp forests are a vital part of a healthy marine ecosystem. Melissa gave you a really good overview of the development of terrestrial forests over time and the layers of succession that take place. While kelp forests share many traits in common with these forests, this timeline of succession and development is not one of them. In fact, that has everything to do with the lifespan of the canopy-forming species within these kelp forests. Now, here in the Pacific Northwest, the two species of canopy-forming kelp that dominate are bull kelp, known as Nereocystis leuciana, and giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrethra. Now, bull kelp is the species most commonly seen within the Salish Sea, and in the spring season, it averages 4 inches of growth a day. Now, giant kelp, seen more commonly out on the outer coast, averages 10 inches a day. So these are quick growing species, and they accomplish this by maximizing their buoyancy. Now, each species has one or more gas-filled bulbs called nematocysts, which allow their photosynthetic blades, which are like their leaves, to float closer to the surface and thus maximize their sunlight exposure. Yet, while they might be quick to grow, they only live between 1 to 7 years, depending on the species. So bull kelp is an annual species, giant kelp is a perennial species. So they're very short-lived in the grand scheme of things. Now, while their lifespans might differ from the canopy-forming species in our conifer forests, like Melissa mentioned, the ecosystem services that they provide are quite similar. Bull kelp and giant kelp are foundation species, also known as ecosystem engineers. And that just means that these species contribute substantially to the structure of habitat, and they may even determine many of the physical and chemical properties of that habitat. So they have a very big role to play. So let's talk through the key players a little bit, starting with our primary producers. Kelp forests play host to a diverse cast of characters, starting with kelp itself, one of the biggest primary producers. Of course, there are other marine algae too. Within the Salish Sea, we have over 27 species of marine algae, and that's not to mention all of the phytoplankton as well. If you're not familiar with that term, phytoplankton are tiny microscopic photosynthetic organisms. So they are also harnessing the sunlight's energy. Of course, next up, moving up the food web, we find a multitude of consumers. Grazing species that might feed on the kelp itself include sea urchins and kelp crab. Small schooling fish, known as bait fish, will seek shelter from predators within kelp forests. And some species utilize the structure of the kelp when spawning as well. Now, these bait fish, such as herring, in turn fuel the remainder of the food web. So their success is key to our healthy Salish Sea. Predators such as sea stars will prowl the forest floors searching for prey. And then, of course, near the top of the food web, we have our marine mammals and our marine birds. So within kelp forests, you might find harbor seals and sea lions foraging. You might find birds such as gulls, puffins, and even great blue heron utilize kelp forests. You might find heron perching on top of the kelp when it's floating at the surface, using it as a dock of sorts from which they can search for fish. Gray whales have been known to utilize kelp forests. They'll go in there looking for small shrimp, like mysid shrimp. And then, of course, perhaps the most iconic kelp forest carnivore is the sea otter, and we're going to talk more about that one shortly. Last but not least, we have our cleanup crew, the deposit feeders. So these are animals that ingest sedimentary material and derive their nutrition from it, whether it's picking it up from the sea floor or picking floating particles out of the water column. So this is the marine version of a decomposer. In kelp forests, you might find sea anemones, sea cucumbers, bivalves like scallops, and maybe even sea squirts. Now, within any ecosystem, some species have broader impacts than others. This is known as a keystone species. When it comes to kelp forests in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, sea otters are the classic example of a keystone species, as they are voracious carnivores that consume sea urchins, which is perhaps the #1 kelp grazer. So when left unchecked, urchins can devastate kelp forests, leaving barrens in their wake. And balance is key, right? So in the kelp forest ecosystems, sea otters help maintain balance by eating the urchins, which in turn protects the kelp. However, there's a big asterisk here in the Salish Sea because sea otters are not common in our local sea. In fact, there's only one resident sea otter here. So in their place, sea stars fill the role of apex predator. And without the kelp that they're helping to protect, the canopy habitat is lost and biodiversity dwindles. So it's a big role that they play. Plus, you also lose out on all the ecosystem services that these forests provide if you don't maintain their health. So talking about ecosystem services, both our lowland conifer forests and kelp forests provide a number of ecosystem services along with the high productivity and biodiversity. They also house canopy forming species, which offer shade and shelter. The structure of the forests themselves act as buffers. So in the case of kelp forests, they'll buffer against currents and wave action, offering increased shoreline protection. And in the case of lowland conifer forests, the trees act as a wind buffer and serve to filter out soot and dust from the air. Now, both lowland conifer forests and kelp serve to sequester carbon. In the case of kelp, when that kelp is uprooted and displaced maybe to the deeper ocean, once it reaches the ocean depths, it may be sequestered there undisturbed for decades, so kind of trapping the carbon for a time. And in the case of old growth forests, which have very large carbon stocks that they have accumulated over thousands of years in their large living and dead woody species, they of course are sequestering carbon as well. And of course, many photosynthetic species produce oxygen within these ecosystems, which aid in increasing our air quality. And last but not least, you can't really quantify the joy that comes from recreating out in kelp forests or our Anacortes Forest Lands. So Now that we've been introduced to both our tree and sea forests, you can likely appreciate that while they are unique ecosystems, they have quite a bit in common in regards to their function. So we'd now like to illustrate just how interconnected these two forest types are and how the health of one can impact the health of another. But first, we're going to take another break just in case any questions have come in. So we will pass it off to Mac to check in before we continue on.
All right, thank you guys. We do have a couple questions. I think we'll get to one or two and then we can address the rest later on. This first question is probably for Sam. Was there once a larger population of sea otters?
That is a great question. From my understanding, at one point there likely was more sea otters within the Salish Sea, but I don't know that there are any historical records showing that there was ever the abundance that we will see out on the outer coasts. So you probably know the history of sea otters. They were heavily hunted for their fur, and so at one point they were completely wiped out from Washington's waters. The sea otters that we see now are actually transplants from Alaska, and as of yet, not many have made their way into the Salish Sea. The only one that is here is named Ollie, and he lives over in the Canadian side of the Salish Sea at Race Rocks. Every once in a while, we will get male sea otters roaming further into the Salish Sea, but they don't stick around for very long. So that's a great question. My understanding is, yeah, at one point there was probably more, but there's not too many historical records that I have seen to back that with exact numbers.
Great, thank you, Sam. Let's see, we'll probably get to about one more here during this pause. Maybe both of you can touch on this. What effects have you seen on these ecosystems by global warming?
Do you want me to go first, or?
If you want to, that's fine.
Sure. So that's a really great question. The climate is really driven by our ocean circulation, like we had stated before. So with global warming, the ocean conveyor belt and other climate influencers are impacted greatly. And actually, in regards to our forest ecosystems, we have seen a reduction in the amount of marine fog, which is really important to our coastal lowland forests, and as well as longer summers, which is harder on the larger conifer trees like Western red cedar in our areas. So we see a number of different effects, a lot of which are still being discovered.
Yeah, so when it comes to kelp forests, there's a couple of factors that'll influence it. One big one that's kind of being studied right now is increased storm activity and more regular storm activity due to overall climate change. Kelp forests, while they grow back very quickly, they're also very susceptible to being uprooted by heavy wave action caused by storms. And the more frequently that they are disturbed in that way, the longer it takes for them to recover. And we've seen a dwindling of biodiversity. There's actually a unique study conducted down in Santa Barbara looking more at giant kelp that essentially concluded that if storms become more frequent, it's probably going to be pretty devastating for our kelp forests. The other factor is temperature. Though there have been mixed results as far as how temperature is going to influence our kelp forests, some studies show that kelp in warming waters does not flourish as well, such as bull kelp. And yet there's another study that was looking at the effects of the blob, which was the big warm body of water off of our coast back in 2014 that persisted. And some kelp forests didn't seem very affected by that, but others dwindled. So there's ongoing studies, but there's a lot of work to be done as far as quantifying the potential impacts of climate change. But those are two of the ones that come up, is storm activity and then increase in temperature. Hopefully that kind of helps to answer that question.
All right, thank you. I think we'll save some of these questions for a little later on and turn it back over to you guys.
Awesome. Okay, so with that, thank you, Mac. We are going to pass it over to Melissa one more time, and she is going to introduce some of the species that go between both our tree forests and our sea forests.
Right, so we have seen how both lowland conifer forests and kelp forests play host to a diverse array of species. But like Sam alluded to, there are some that utilize the productivity of both the trees and the seas. So first we have the river otter, which den on shore and forage in aquatic environments. Then we have eagles and osprey, which might nest in the forest and get their meals from the sea. And we also have intertidal foragers like raccoons and crows, and even deer who utilize the shorelines when licking salt from the rocks. Marble murrelets are unique in that they have a remarkable life history that is directly tied to the old growth forests, specifically in where they nest, and the productivity of the sea, which is where they fly out to forage each day. So these are just a few examples of this go-between species that use both ecosystems. And then there are the two keystone species that connect these two worlds, which are beaver and salmon. So beavers, the ecosystem engineer located in our terrestrial forest, are experts when it comes to modifying their surroundings to fit their needs, just like we are. The result of beavers' diligent work are rich riparian areas used by many different species that depend on these habitats for all or part of their life cycle. Another important beaver behavior is that they move quite readily into new areas. Their instinct to spread and find new locales makes their potential and certainly historic range span the continent right up to the intertidal zones on the coast. But these beavers aren't just coastal wanderers, they're also residents. Greg Hood, a senior research scientist at the Skagit River System Cooperative, surveyed 25 kilometers of Skagit tidal shrublands and found 125 beaver dams and 14 lodges, which is a construction density that rivals most rivers. So when he dragged seine nets through beaver pools, he found them teeming with all sorts of fish, like stickleback, prickly sculpin, lamprey, and juvenile Chinook salmon. So at low tide, when receding waters would otherwise have flushed baby salmon towards wading mergansers, great blue herons, and kingfishers, he counted over 3 times more Chinook in beaver pools than other channels, suggesting that these young fish were sheltering in the beaver-built pockets. So these estuaries are salmon havens and protected portals from the sea that lead to the forest, maintained by our rodents.
Yeah, so speaking of salmon, salmon are another keystone species vital to the health of both our tree and sea forests. In fact, some refer to salmon as the lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest. Now, salmon are unique in that they are an anadromous species, meaning that they spend the very beginning and the very end of their lives in freshwater habitat, and the majority of their adult life out in the open ocean. So as such, they connect our forest and our sea in a very real way. Let's talk about their life history a little bit, as that illustrates why their reach is so great. First off, clean streams host the salmon eggs, and then once the eggs hatch, these fry will feed on insects and seek shade and shelter provided by forest vegetation. And then once they make their way out to sea, as young smolts, they might seek shelter in kelp forests until they are big enough to fend for themselves in the open ocean. And then as adults, they will rely on the bait fish, which we talked about earlier, species which also rely on kelp forests, and because they will be eating those bait fish. Now, when adult salmon return to their natal streams to spawn at the very end of their lives, they bring with them all of the marine nutrients carried within their bodies, nutrients they will leave in the forest stream, and then that is shared amongst plants and animals in that ecosystem. Now, several studies have worked to measure the impact of salmon on the forest they return to, and while there is some debate as to the exact degree by which salmon modify these ecosystems, there is no question that the nutrients they supply to streamside ecosystems is great and qualifies them as a keystone species. So one such study, organized by Robert Naiman with the University of Washington, reported that streamside vegetation gets just under 25% of its nitrogen from salmon, while there are even other studies that report up to 70% of the nitrogen found within riparian vegetation comes from that salmon migration. Now, one study concluded that trees on the banks of salmon-stocked rivers grow more than 3 times faster than their counterparts along salmon-free rivers. And going along with that statistic is that some report Sitka spruce take about 86 years rather than the typical 300 years to reach 500 centimeters thick when growing next to salmon-stocked rivers. So the nutrient loads that salmon bring to streamside ecosystems is unparalleled. And in turn, the streamside vegetation provides food and habitat for the salmon, bringing this relationship full circle.
All right, so the question is, how do these keystone species and the multitude of go-between species traverse between these two forests? So how do they move from the trees to the sea? Well, before large-scale human development, most habitats flowed naturally into each other, creating an ongoing continuum of ecosystems. But despite human development, many still transition naturally today. The transitional space between natural habitats is what's known as an ecotone. Within an ecotone, a phenomenon called the edge effect can be observed, which is the changes in diversity and communities of plants and animals. So many times the number of species and populations within the ecotone are actually greater than in either adjoining habitat alone. But when human activities divide ecosystems with structures such as fences and roads, that is known as habitat fragmentation. This also creates an edge effect around the remaining habitat, but in contrast to ecotones, it puts a negative pressure on the ecosystem. So this habitat fragmentation results in 5 phenomena that negatively impact our ecosystems. So it results in decreased habitat area and increased isolation because of the disjunction between habitats, which then also reduces the movement of wildlife among these fragments because of the space and possible barriers between them. Fragmentation also reduces species richness of plants and animals, so the number of different types of plants and animals, and can often change the composition of entire communities, as well as compromising core ecosystem functions like pollination. So studies of fragmented forest habitats have found that nearly 20% of the world's remaining forest is within 100 meters of a forest edge, 50% is within 500 meters, and 70% is within 1 kilometer of an edge. Therefore, most forests are well within the range where human activities like altered microclimate and non-forest species that are common in the edges may influence and degrade their integrity and resiliency. So in the past, it was a fluid transition between ecosystem to ecosystem and species could move freely, but now with large-scale habitat fragmentation and its negative effects, how do the beaver and salmon and other go-between species get between the kelp and conifer forest? Sam is about to give you that answer.
Yeah, it's called wildlife corridors, guys. So the connections between fragmented ecosystems are known as wildlife corridors. One way to think about the use of corridors is to consider how hallways in a building function. So the hallways, or corridors, serve to link the places of activity. People confined to a single room cannot live in a comfortable and natural manner, as we have all started to learn over this past month. So just as hallways enhance the operation of a building, environmental corridors increase the value of natural resource areas. Ecosystems such as wetlands become even more productive when linked to core habitats. Fish and wildlife populations, native plant distribution, and even clean water all depend on movement through environmental corridors. In other words, corridors can be thought of as lifelines for the living and help support wildlife, natural resources, and us humans. Now, there are 3 key benefits to wildlife corridors, the first of which is species diversity. Corridors enhance species diversity by giving wildlife access between habitat fragments. This includes plant diversity, because as wildlife moves between the fragments, seeds and pollen are carried with it. Now at NC State, a study was conducted to assess the use of wildlife corridors, and the verdict of the study was that corridors work as superhighways. So of the 20 species they studied, 18 moved more frequently with a corridor, and some even 10 times as much. Other studies have corroborated their findings, results showing that areas connected by corridors can have 20% or more plant species than those without. Now, the movement of wildlife, plant seeds, and pollen also enhances the gene pools of species that utilize them. So without gene flow between fragments, species can become more susceptible to disease and extinction due to inbreeding or lack of suitable mates. Now, the second benefit, nutrient transfer. Corridors are also lifelines for nutrient transfer and therefore overall ecosystem health, because while plants and animals are able to move, nutrients are moved right along with them through life and death cycles. And last but not least, climate resiliency. As climate and natural systems shift in unpredictable ways, corridors could prove more important than ever, allowing species to shift in response to climatic variance. Now, according to Mead Crosby, a senior scientist at UW's Climate Impacts Group, under climate change, these corridors will become superhighways for animals that are seeking new places to live. Okay, so species diversity, nutrient transfer, climate resiliency, these are all key features of healthy and resilient ecosystems, illustrating the importance of corridors. Now, Representative Beyer of Virginia, noting a report written by the United Nations, puts it best. So he said 1 in 5 animal and plant species in the US are at risk of extinction due to habitat loss and fragmentation. One of the simplest yet most effective things we can do is provide them ample opportunity to move across those lands and waters. Now, wildlife corridors come in many forms, and not all corridor types will be suitable for all target species. One way to categorize wildlife corridors is by their continuity or lack thereof. So let's start with stepping stones, which are discontinuous areas of habitat such as wetlands, roadside vegetation, or the trees in your yard that allow species to safely traverse between core habitats. Now, in well-developed areas, such as Fidalgo Island for the most part, this corridor type is most common, but not necessarily suitable for all native species. So, for example, let's think about birds. While birds may be able to traverse from patch to patch with relative ease, larger mammals could have a harder time of it, depending on what structures and barriers separate these stepping stones. Now, next up, we have continuous corridors, which are defined as uninterrupted swaths of land, such as ridge lines or riparian habitat lining a river. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about that one in just a second. But first, we have to mention wildlife crossings. These are not natural corridors. They are man-made structures that allow animals to cross barriers safely, such as a highway overpass and underpass. But these two function to aid migration and natural movement of species through more urban developed areas. So let's go into a bit more depth on riparian corridors, as they're some of the most widely utilized. In fact, according to the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, over 70% of all terrestrial wildlife species utilize riparian corridors. If you're not familiar with the term riparian, though we've used it a couple times, it's the habitat right along the edge of a stream or river. Okay? So the wonderful thing about riparian corridors is that both terrestrial and aquatic organisms can benefit from them. The same vegetation that provides cover for terrestrial species moving through the corridor enhances the stream habitat via shading the water and thus cooling the temperatures, stabilizing the stream banks to slow erosion, providing food and nutrients in the form of falling foliage, and even the woody debris creates natural pools, riffles, and waterfalls, each of which provide niche habitat for organisms within the stream. But even though continuous corridors might be accessible to a greater range of species as opposed to stepping stone corridors, it is still important to note that size matters. The width of the corridors will influence their efficacy, an important consideration to keep in mind when planning management strategies, which brings us back to our local ecosystems here on Fidalgo Island. But before we pass it off to Melissa, we're going to make one last pause to see if any other questions have come in. So we'll check in with Mac, and if not, we will continue right along.
All right, we do have several questions. A lot of these go back to some of the marine species. Here's a question for Sam. Can you tell us how these sea stars are doing? Can you provide an update on sea star wasting disease?
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. So for those of you who are not familiar with sea star wasting disease and or syndrome, we first noticed it back in 2013, and it was a disease that impacted sea stars of a variety of species up and down the West Coast. It's a really nasty disease in that essentially the sea stars disintegrated, you could say. As far as the current status, from what I've heard in the last year or so, there are pockets of sea stars locally that are recovering, but that is not throughout the entirety of the Salish Sea. So the theory is that, or not the theory, but the worry is that while some species are starting to recover because the juveniles are taking over, the fear is that once they reach adulthood, symptoms could crop up again. I don't think it's been enough time for us to fully know if that is the case or not. The other thing about sea star wasting syndrome is that we were talking about climate change earlier. The symptoms seem to be exacerbated by increase in water temperatures. So if we continue to see increases in change here in the Salish Sea, the fear is that we could have another wave of that wasting syndrome. So kind of in summary, it's not all doom and gloom. Certain pockets are coming back, but it's still something that the researchers here locally are monitoring.
All right, thanks, Sam. I also have a question for Melissa. What kind of animals are essential for forests the way that otters are for kelp? So basically, what are some keystone species that we have locally?
So besides the beaver, we also have the pileated woodpecker. So that's also a keystone species in our forest because it does create a lot of habitat for other animals that use our forests. So pileated woodpeckers will make those large holes in the trees that you see if you're walking around in our forests. And those cavities are actually used by a lot of other animals like bats, American martins, and owls. So those pileated woodpeckers are also very, very important in creating structure in our forests, just like beaver are, and sea otters and sea stars.
Great. These are great questions. Thank you to our audience. We'll have time for some more a little bit later, so I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mac. Okay, guys, so now we're going to transition to talking a little bit more about our local Anacortes Forest Lands and, of course, Fidalgo Island. So for that, I will pass it back to Melissa.
All right. So now that we have our corridor benefits in mind, we want to look at our island's own priority habitats and corridors. So as you can see, the island of Fidalgo is, well, it's already an island, which means that these corridors that connect our tree and sea forests are especially important when it comes to maintaining the resiliency of these two neighboring ecosystems. So this map, although it's only created from public records and existing sources and also incomplete, does give a helpful representation of some of the important fish and wildlife conservation areas on and immediately surrounding our island. So it shows that many priority species use our nearshore areas like herring, which are the blue diagonals area, the blue diagonal shaded area, sea urchins, which are the reddish pink diagonal areas, and both shorebirds and waterfowl, which are the both purplish blue and orange solid shaded areas. And on land, we also have large areas of biodiversity. So those are those solid green sections. And then we also have habitat of local importance, which we consider on this map to be the ACFL. So our community has done an amazing job protecting natural spaces on Fidalgo, like of course our ACFL, and because of this, we are only second to Portland, Oregon, as having the most acres of preserved natural space per capita of any city in the United States. But the continued protection of the ACFL and other natural areas includes protecting the corridors that exist between them and the sea, so they do not become that island within an island, or in other words, an isolated habitat fragment. So where are corridors likely to exist on our island? So the main potential riparian corridors you can see on the map on the left include the Ace of Hearts, Cranberry, Toot and Whistle Creeks, as well as Beaver Brook and Clyde River. This map also tells us whether or not these potential corridors have been noted to be used by fish. So the red rivers means they meet the physical criteria to be used by fish, and the blue areas mean they do not meet the criteria to be used by fish, while the yellow remains unclassified. So although fish are definitely not the only important species that use those streams, they're excellent indicators of stream health. Their presence indicates biological integrity and water quality because of their ability to move to different environments based on changing conditions. So now let's compare this map to the one on the right. Here you can see the locations of barriers, which are mostly culverts within these waterways. Many of our streams are diverted at some point along their path through culverts under streets and directed out to sea. But despite these barriers, many of these riparian corridors are still being used, at least partially, by fish. This shows that even in these disrupted corridors, it is possible that they can still continue to provide habitat and connections between the forest and the sea. So now let's look at our potential terrestrial corridors. So because of human development, most of our terrestrial corridors take on the form of stepping stones to and from the sea. So the pink areas on this map represent developed areas that have some form of mitigation or native growth protection easements as part of the deed to the property. So these are places where the city has been successful in securing wildlife habitats in conjunction with development, but where the city hasn't been successful in creating continuous corridors, we can help as individual community members. So to help create these pathways for wildlife or corridors, this can be as easy as planting a native species, making a choice to stop using chemical pesticides, or even creating a non-mowed section of your yard to allow the grasses to grow naturally. You can also take these steps one step further and make your yard a certified wildlife habitat. So as of 2008, 528 residential yards on Fidalgo and Guaymas Islands have been certified as wildlife habitats through the National Wildlife Federation, or as wildlife sanctuaries through the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So you can find more information about this and this awesome habitat checklist online on nwf.org. So this project is strictly voluntary and it runs on the honor system. There is no habitat police, but it's a great way to ensure connections between our sea and tree forests. So if a backyard habitat is not your cup of tea, you can still help both ecosystems and the corridors between them by being a conscientious user. So the ACFL is managed with different user groups in mind to maintain the balance of preservation and recreation. With the high number of users, each individual choice does make an impact on the overall health of not only the ACFL, but the kelp forests as well. So research has found that just a 1% increase in the paved surface area negatively impacts the biodiversity of any given watershed. So it's easy to see how important our behaviors, no matter how insignificant, are when it comes to protecting our local watersheds. So one thing you can do to be a forest friend is to pack out all your waste when you're enjoying either forest. So pet waste, for example, impacts water quality in both of our forests as it makes its way through the watershed because it harbors bacteria, pathogens, and parasites. But this is really an easy way to do your part and make a big impact on both systems and those corridors. Secondly, our forests are home to diverse species, and will continue to be a wonderful commons for all inhabitants and visitors if we collectively take care and leave everything in its place. Like I say to the kids I teach, everything in the forest has a job. So the old saying, take only pictures and leave only footprints, is a simple ethic that we can all adapt that does a great deal in maintaining the integrity of our ecosystems. Just make sure your footprints are on those trails. So another thing we can do is stay on the trail, even when it's muddy. This includes dogs that should always be on a leash. So going off trail creates social trails, which are the trails you might see in the forest, especially in the wintertime when there's not as much foliage, that are not marked and can look kind of unmaintained. So these social trails disrupt sensitive flora like moss, which take hundreds of years to grow, and are also susceptible to erosion because these social trails are usually, they're taking the most direct path to the intended destination instead of following the terrain.
Yeah, so this applies to tide pooling trails too, guys. When beachcombing and tide pooling, please be conscientious of the flora and fauna beneath your feet. Barnacles are living things too, so try not to crush too many of them. In areas with set tide pool trails, like at Rosario Beach, just tread lightly and stick to the path so that these ecosystems can continue to flourish. So guys, we hope that this talk helped to illustrate just how interconnected our local ecosystems are and the importance of this connection to local wildlife. Let's work together to ensure that these natural lands serve as corridors for wildlife rather than highways for runoff and negative human influence. Now, before we wrap it up, we do have some thank yous. Thank you to the City of Anacortes for providing those maps you guys saw at the end of the presentation. And of course, thank you to Friends of the Forest for hosting us. And thank you for the beautiful photos provided by Near Pond Nagam, Island Adventures Whale Watching, and Friends of the Forest. Really helped to brighten up our slides a bit. We mentioned this earlier, but once again, if you guys are interested in reading more, just like we did for these past couple of months, we are going to list all the resources that were utilized in this presentation. I believe Asa will be linking that in the email. If not, it will be available through Friends of the Forest. Yeah, if you want to do some extra reading or studying, feel free to check out any of these sources. And with that, I will pass it back to Asa.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I hope everyone out there found some useful information in there. Whether you are a dog owner or not, there was a lot to learn in that presentation. So thank you to both of you, Sam and Melissa, for all the work. I mean, you can look at the list of references and see how much work went into that. So thank you to both of you for that. In just a second, I am going to turn it over to Mackenzie, who's going to go through the last bit of questions here. We're going to make sure we get as many questions answered as possible. But I just wanted to touch base really quick. One of the questions was, should we be emphasizing corridors in the critical areas ordinance under review by City Council? And that is a fantastic question. The short answer is yes, absolutely. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that our mission is to preserve the forest land through education, outreach, and stewardship. You see a lot of our education. You see a lot of our hikes that Melissa leads that the community can go on, our hikes for the students of the Anacortes School District, for all 3rd and 7th graders, and hopefully kindergartners, which was our plan this year, but got stymied by COVID. So what you don't see quite as often is some of the behind the scenes work that we do, going to city council meetings, planning commission meetings, and I've been going to all of the planning commission meetings regarding the critical areas ordinance, and wildlife corridors are indeed one of the main things that we've been pushing to try and get recognized in those regulations. So the Planning Commission, that process has completed. At the end of that, the city staff did put some incentives within the critical areas regulations to incentivize folks and developers to maintain or establish wildlife corridors, but there's no any sort of regulation or requirement for that. So that is one of the really big things that we are pushing for with the City Council as the critical areas regulations go through the City Council. those meetings were supposed to be happening right now, essentially. So they have been postponed entirely until after COVID, when we can all meet again together. So that has been pushed to the side, but that is one of the main things that we are pushing for, is not only the requirements to protect these wildlife corridors, but to even map them at all, because we don't have any definitive maps of where these exist on the island. So that is a huge thing, and I thank you, Mark, for asking that question, because a very important aspect of what we're doing right now. And that's one of those things that I just want to draw your attention one more time to the Give Big campaign. That is another area you would be supporting us in, not just our programming, not just our educational programming and our community programming, but also all that work we do with the City Council, that we do with the Parks and Rec Department, that we do with the Planning Commission, all of that as well. So I'm going to put one more plug out there for the Give Big campaign, and I put it in the chat. I'm not sure if it showed up there. If it didn't, the link will be going out with the follow-up email tomorrow. So you can go to Give Big Washington, WA.org/Friends of the Forest, or click on that link tomorrow. And Mackenzie, I will send it back over to you so we can keep going through some of these great questions we've got here.
All right, perfect. So it looks like we actually have a couple questions about sea otters, a couple questions and comments, so we can address those first. We have one comment that says, during the 1950s and 60s, we observed sea otters regularly in the kelp forests around the San Juan Islands and even around Fidalgo. And they suggested that there may be some documentation from the Samish, Lummi, or Swinomish historians. So that would be something great for us to check out.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the recommendation too, especially for the sources. There's always more reading to do. So thank you. I'll look into that.
All right, an additional sea otter question. Are there plans to reintroduce more sea otters locally? This audience member mentioned they saw many in Southeast Alaska.
So within the Salish Sea, I don't know that there are any plans ongoing to introduce sea otters. I know the last update I heard was they are still monitoring populations out on the open coast and around Vancouver Island, Canada, just to see how they are naturally spreading, because they do seem to be naturally spreading. The males tend to veer off a little bit more. So we'll see. Maybe eventually they might naturally spread in here, but as of now, I don't know of any plans to introduce them to the Salish Sea specifically.
Great, thank you, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen otters in the Swinomish Channel. Are these sea otters or river otters, and what's the difference?
River otters, they are almost definitely river otters. We have quite a few of them around Fidalgo Island and throughout the San Juans. The key differences here, sea otters are marine mammals. They are primarily dependent on ocean habitat. River otters are not technically marine mammals. They are a terrestrial species that relies heavily on aquatic environments. So you can find river otters inland across North America, anywhere there's a lake, stream, river. Here, they just happen to utilize the marine habitat because that's what's available to them, but they are not relegated to marine habitats alone like sea otters are. So entirely different species with different life histories.
Great. Do you have any comments on microplastics in the waterways or sea?
Ooh. Melissa, I know you had something to show here.
Right, so microplastics are one of the things I care about a lot, and there is a lot of impacts of them. So I do have a jar of microplastics right here. I don't know if you can see them. They're tiny, tiny little pieces of plastic. These ones particularly are called nurdles. So they're the raw plastic pellets that are used to make a lot of plastic products. A lot of times they will end up in the ocean after traveling on container ships. So those are one form of microplastics. There's also glitter is another common example of microplastics. You can also find them in body washes and even sometimes from our clothes. So microplastics are kind of pervasive throughout the environment, and they do end up entering the food chain. I know locally with these nurdles, a lot of them look like fish eggs, which end up on our beaches, which can be eaten then by animals that do eat those fish eggs as part of the food web. So they definitely do have an impact in both ecosystems by entering through the food chain. I don't know, Sam, if you wanted to add anything else to that?
Yeah, that's a good summary. Essentially, at this point, we're finding microplastics in almost all layers of the food web, including in what we eat. So it really does come full circle back to us. So just trying to make conscientious purchases and properly disposing of our waste where we can is will help us, not just the marine species out there.
Great, thank you guys. Are there any animals that are disappearing from the old growth forests? This might be a question for Melissa.
That's a really great question. So one iconic species that is really common, or was really common, and has pretty much disappeared from the Puget Sound region. It needs large areas of continuous old growth habitat, is the spotted owl. So that's one species that is really not seen around here anymore because of the impact to our old growth forests. I don't know if I said in the presentation, but I think we only have about 4% of the original area of old growth forests in the entire Puget Sound region remaining. So 95 or 96% has previously been logged, which does impact a lot of those species which are endemic or native and depend on our old growth forests.
Thank you, Melissa. Have beavers ever been endangered or critically low, so much so to the extent that they need to be reintroduced?
That's another great question. So beavers, like I said before, used to span coast to coast. There's a really great expert on beavers. His name is Ben Goldfarb, and he does a lot of environmental journalism on beavers. So I've heard from him and listening to his talks. He actually wrote a book on beavers, that beavers, the numbers used to be in the millions. And I know when they were hunting the beavers, they went down to maybe the hundreds of thousands. Don't quote my numbers here, but I know a ton were harvested, and a lot of times they did disappear from regions where they did originally exist. I know he talks about them existing even out in Arizona, where it's now desert. There used to be beavers. And I have heard in terms of reintroducing them to areas, I know they do trap beavers in different areas around the US and then drop them in new locations to help with habitat building. So there's a ton of information out there on beavers, and I definitely want to direct you to Ben Goldfarb's book, and he has talks and he can tell you a lot more about them.
Thank you. That was our last question that we have in the queue right now, but I think we can hang out for just another minute or so if there's any lingering questions that we can address here.
Yeah, and as we do that, I just want to take another minute to just thank everybody for being here. This is, a very new process for us as well. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Hopefully we'll be able to do this in person sometime in the not too distant future. But if we are needing to go online, we're happy to do that again. I hope it was a useful and informative evening for you all. I also want to thank you for being such good stewards of the forest. I know it's been really hectic out there. There's been a lot of people, which is a good thing because they're getting out and they're using it and they're being outside and using it as that mental and emotional escape and a place of feeling connected. So that's a good thing. It's also very hectic, I'm sure, and can be scary sometimes, especially if you're in the at-risk population. So thank you. I know everybody on this webcast, just by being here, is somebody that cares about the forest and is, I'm sure, respecting the protocol that has been put forth in order to keep it open and keep it useful for all of the people. So thank you very much for that as well. And I think it's looking like no more questions are coming in. So I think at this point, we'll go ahead and thank our presenters, Sam Murphy and Friends of the Forest's own Melissa Courtney. Thank you to both of you for all the work you put into this and all the knowledge that you conveyed to everybody here. If you do have more questions, you can always email us, info@friendsoftheacfl.org. Thanks again for being here. And, you know, hopefully we'll be able to have our hikes going up again soon. We'll be able to have all of our programming going again in the not too distant future. We've got some really exciting things on the horizon, some really exciting programs and new events happening. So keep checking our website, and as soon as we are able to lead groups and be out in the forest with you all again, we cannot wait to be there.
Thank you,
Sam.
Isa.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And we will see you all soon.